The town of Willow Creek sat nestled in a valley, surrounded by dense woods and shrouded in an air of mystery. It was a quaint town, the kind where everyone knew each other, and secrets were hard to keep. But some secrets were too dark, too twisted, to be spoken aloud. On the outskirts of this seemingly peaceful town stood an old, abandoned playhouse. Its paint, once vibrant, had long since peeled away, leaving a skeletal husk of rotting wood and shattered windows. The playhouse had been silent for decades, but the townsfolk remembered. They remembered the laughter that once filled its halls, the joy of children's performances, and the night it all ended in flames. It was said that on quiet nights, if you stood close enough, you could still hear the laughter of children echoing from within its charred walls. Most dismissed these tales as superstition, the kind of ghost stories that towns weave into their fabric. But some, those who had heard the laughter for themselves, knew better. Claire Johnson and her family were newcomers to Willow Creek, having moved from the city to escape the chaos and find a simpler life. Claire was a single mother, trying to create a new beginning for herself and her 7-year-old son, Max. They had moved into a charming old house, the kind that creaked and groaned with history, but it felt like home. On their first evening in Willow Creek, Claire unpacked boxes while Max explored the house and the sprawling backyard. He had always been an adventurous child, with a boundless imagination that often took him to places unseen by adults. That evening, Max returned from his explorations with a look of excitement in his eyes. "Mom, look what I found," he exclaimed, holding up an old, tattered flyer. Claire took the flyer from him and examined it. The paper was yellowed with age and the ink had faded, but she could still make out the words. "The Willow Creek Children's Theater Presents. A Midsummer Night's Dream." Below the title was a date, September 12th, 1974, and a list of child actors' names. "Where did you find this, Max?" she asked, curious. "It was in the shed out back," Max replied. "Can we go see the playhouse, Mom? Please." Claire felt a shiver run down her spine. She had heard whispers about the old playhouse from the neighbors, tales of tragedy and hauntings. But she didn't want to dampen Max's enthusiasm. Maybe seeing the playhouse would put those ghost stories to rest. "All right," Claire said with a smile, ruffling Max's hair. "We'll go see it tomorrow." That night, as Claire lay in bed, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over her. She listened to the sounds of the old house, the creaks and groans that were becoming familiar, and tried to convince herself that they were just the noises of an aging structure. But as she drifted off to sleep, she thought she heard something else, a faint, distant sound that could have been the wind. Or it could have been the echo of children's laughter, carried on the night air. The next day, Claire and Max set out to find the playhouse. They walked through the woods, following a narrow, overgrown path that led them deeper into the forest. The air grew cooler, and the trees seemed to close in around them, casting long shadows on the ground. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged into a clearing. There, in the center, stood the playhouse. It was exactly as Claire had imagined, weathered and decaying, with an air of melancholy that hung heavy in the air. The windows were broken, and the door hung ajar, creaking in the breeze. Max ran ahead, his excitement undiminished. Claire followed more slowly, her steps hesitant. As she approached the playhouse, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was as if the air itself was charged with a palpable sense of dread. Max was already inside, exploring the dim interior. Claire stepped through the doorway, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. The playhouse was filled with remnants of its past, tattered costumes, broken props, and dusty old seats. Max was rummaging through a box of toys, his laughter echoing off the walls. Claire's unease grew as she watched her son. There was something off about this place, something that felt wrong. She called out to Max, her voice trembling slightly. "Max, let's not stay here too long, okay?" Max looked up, his eyes wide with excitement. "Just a little longer, Mom. Please." Claire sighed, unable to resist his plea. She wandered through the playhouse, her footsteps stirring up clouds of dust. As she explored, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see shadowy figures lurking in the corners. Then she heard it. A soft, eerie giggle. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down her spine. Claire turned, her heart pounding, but there was no one there. She tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but the feeling of being watched persisted. "Max, it's time to go," she said firmly, walking over to her son and taking his hand. Max protested, but Claire was insistent. They left the playhouse, the door creaking shut behind them. As they walked back through the woods, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. She glanced back repeatedly, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. When they finally emerged from the woods and reached their house, Claire breathed a sigh of relief. She hoped that leaving the playhouse behind would also leave behind the unease that had settled over her. But that night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the sound of that eerie giggle. It echoed in her mind, mingling with the creaks and groans of the old house. And as she drifted off to sleep, she thought she heard it again, faint and distant, a reminder that some secrets refuse to stay buried. Claire awoke the next morning with the eerie echoes of the previous night still lingering in her mind. She tried to brush off the unsettling feeling as nothing more than an overactive imagination. After all, they had just moved into a new house in a new town. Adjustments always came with a touch of anxiety. Determined to start the day fresh, she went about her morning routine, but the memory of the playhouse gnawed at her. Max, on the other hand, seemed more excited than ever. Over breakfast, he talked non-stop about the playhouse, the toys he had found, and the costumes that, in his words, looked like they were from a magical kingdom. "Mom, can we go back today?" he asked, his eyes shining with eagerness. Claire hesitated, remembering the chill that had enveloped her the day before. She wanted to keep Max happy, but she also felt a strong need to protect him from whatever strange energy seemed to linger in that place. "Maybe later," she said, trying to sound nonchalant. "I need to run some errands in town today. Why don't we explore Willow Creek a bit more instead?" Max pouted but eventually agreed, and they set off into town. Willow Creek was charming, with its cobblestone streets, quaint shops, and friendly faces. Claire hoped that immersing themselves in the town's community would help her shake off the lingering dread from their playhouse visit. As they wandered, Claire made a mental note of the places she wanted to visit again: a cozy-looking bakery, a small bookstore, and the local library. The library caught her interest the most. She had always loved getting lost in the pages of a good book, and perhaps there she could find more information about the town's history and the mysterious playhouse. They spent the morning exploring, and by lunchtime, Max had almost forgotten about the playhouse. They stopped at a small cafe where the owner, Mrs. Thompson, a kind elderly woman with twinkling eyes, welcomed them warmly. "New in town, aren't you?" Mrs. Thompson asked as she served them sandwiches and lemonade. "Yes, we just moved here," Claire replied, smiling. "It's a lovely town." "It is," Mrs. Thompson agreed, "though it does have its share of old stories and legends." Claire's curiosity piqued. "Like what?" Mrs. Thompson leaned in, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Well, there's the old playhouse on the outskirts. They say it's haunted by the spirits of children who died in a terrible fire many years ago. Some folks claim they can still hear the laughter of those poor souls on quiet nights. Claire felt a shiver run down her spine. She forced a smile. We've heard a little about that. My son found an old flyer about a play there. Mrs. Thompson's expression turned serious. Be careful around that place. It's been abandoned for a reason. Some things are best left undisturbed. Claire nodded, her unease returning. After lunch, they headed to the library, where Claire hoped to find more concrete information about the Playhouse and its history. The Willow Creek Library was a quaint building, filled with the scent of old books and polished wood. Max immediately gravitated toward the children's section, while Claire approached the librarian, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose. Excuse me, Claire began. I'm new in town and was wondering if you have any records or books about the old playhouse on the outskirts. The librarian's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. We do have some archives that mention it. Follow me. Claire followed her to a section of the library dedicated to local history. The librarian pulled out a few dusty volumes and an old newspaper archive. The Playhouse has quite a history, the librarian said. It was a popular spot for children's performances back in the day, but it was abandoned after the tragic fire. Many believe it to be haunted. Claire thanked her and sat down with the books and newspapers. As she read through the old articles, she learned more about the fire. It had occurred on the night of a much-anticipated performance. The cause was never definitively determined, but the fire spread quickly, trapping several children inside. Their bodies were never recovered, and the playhouse was left to decay. One article in particular caught her attention. It was an interview with the Playhouse's former director, a man named Victor Hargrave. He spoke of his passion for the theater and his devastation at the loss. But there was something unsettling in his words, a hint of obsession with the Playhouse and the children who performed there. As Claire delved deeper into the history, she felt a growing sense of foreboding. The more she learned, the more she realized that the Playhouse was not just a relic of the past. It was a focal point for something dark and restless. Lost in thought, she almost didn't hear Max calling her name. He stood at the edge of the children's section, holding a book. "Mom, look at this," he said excitedly. Claire walked over to him, her mind still heavy with the Playhouse's grim history. Max handed her a book titled Tales of Willow Creek. She flipped through it, noticing a chapter dedicated to the town's legends and ghost stories. One of the illustrations was of the Playhouse, engulfed in flames with shadowy figures in the windows. Claire's heart raced. She closed the book and smiled at Max, trying to hide her anxiety. "That's interesting, honey. Why don't we check it out and read it at home?" Max agreed, and they checked out the book. As they left the library, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that their lives had become entwined with the dark history of the Playhouse. She knew she had to protect Max, but she also felt an inexplicable pull to uncover the truth. That night, as she tucked Max into bed, he looked up at her with wide eyes. "Mom, do you think the children at the Playhouse are still there?" Claire's breath caught in her throat. She forced a reassuring smile. "I don't know, Max, but I do know that you're safe here with me. Now get some sleep, okay?" Max nodded and closed his eyes. Claire sat by his bed until his breathing evened out, then quietly left his room. As she lay in her own bed, she listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. But underneath it all, she thought she could still hear it, the faint, distant echo of children's laughter haunting the edges of her consciousness. Sleep came slowly that night, and when it did, It brought with it unsettling dreams of fire, shadows, and a playhouse filled with ghostly children, their eyes pleading for release. The morning dawned with a crisp chill in the air, the first hint of autumn creeping into Willow Creek. Claire awoke feeling more resolved than ever. She had spent much of the previous night thinking about the playhouse and the unsettling feelings it stirred. She couldn't keep Max away from it without understanding more. If there was something dangerous there, she needed to know. After breakfast, Claire reluctantly agreed to take Max back to the playhouse. She justified it as an opportunity to face her fears and hopefully dispel them. They dressed warmly and set out, the cool air filled with the scent of fallen leaves and earth. The path through the woods seemed longer this time, each step echoing in the silent forest. Max chatted excitedly about the playhouse, but Claire's responses were distracted, her mind preoccupied with the warning from Mrs. Thompson and the haunting stories she'd read. They reached the clearing, and there it stood, the old playhouse looming ominously in the morning light. Its broken windows and rotting wood seemed even more sinister than before. The once vibrant paint was now a ghostly white, flicking away like dead skin. Max darted ahead, his curiosity undimmed, but Claire hesitated at the edge of the clearing. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, and followed her son. As she crossed the threshold, she felt the air grow colder, a chill that seemed to seep into her bones. Inside, the playhouse was just as they had left it, filled with the remnants of a forgotten past. Max went straight to the box of toys and costumes, his eyes shining with excitement. Claire wandered deeper into the playhouse, her footsteps echoing eerily in the empty space. She paused in what had once been the main performance area, her eyes drawn to a large, cracked mirror propped against the wall. It was covered in dust, but as she wiped it clean, she saw her own reflection staring back, pale and uneasy. For a moment, she thought she saw something move behind her, a shadowy figure that vanished as quickly as it appeared. A soft giggle echoed through the room, sending a shiver down her spine. Claire spun around, but there was no one there. She tried to tell herself it was just the wind, but the sound had been too distinct, too human. "Mom, look at this." Max's voice broke through her thoughts. Claire turned to see Max holding up an old, tattered costume, a small prince's outfit, complete with a faded crown. He looked so happy, so innocent, that her heart ached. "That's nice, sweetheart," she said, forcing a smile. "But we shouldn't stay here too long." Max's face fell. "Why not? It's fun here." Claire knelt down beside him, taking his hand. "I know it seems fun, but this place isn't safe. It's old and falling apart. I don't want you getting hurt." Max nodded reluctantly, but Claire could see the disappointment in his eyes. She stood up, her resolve hardening. They needed to leave. Now. As they made their way toward the exit, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut with a resounding bang. Claire's heart leapt into her throat. She tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as she pulled harder, but the door remained stubbornly closed. "Mom." Max's voice trembled with fear. Claire turned to see her son standing in the middle of the room, his eyes wide. Shadows seemed to dance around him, flickering in and out of existence. The air grew colder still, and the laughter returned, louder this time, more insistent. "It's okay, Max," Claire said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're going to be okay." She tugged at the door again, her hands trembling. Suddenly it flew open, and Claire stumbled backward, pulling Max with her. They dashed out of the playhouse, not stopping until they were well into the woods, the haunted laughter fading behind them. They reached their house breathless and shaken. Claire locked the door behind them, her mind racing. There was something terribly wrong with that playhouse, something beyond her understanding. She needed help, someone who knew more about the supernatural, someone who could help her protect Max. That evening, as she sat by the fire, her thoughts turned to the town librarian. Perhaps she could find more answers there. Claire resolved to visit the library again the next day. She couldn't let this go, not when her son's safety was at stake. As she watched Max play with his toys, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and dance, and the faint echo of children's laughter lingered in the corners of her mind. The Playhouse was forbidden for a reason, and Claire was determined to uncover its secrets, no matter the cost. The following morning, the sky was overcast, casting a gloomy pall over Willow Creek. Claire felt a heaviness in her chest as she prepared breakfast, her thoughts consumed by the eerie events at the Playhouse. She had to understand what was happening, not just for her own peace of mind, but to keep Max safe. Max, however, seemed unaffected by the previous day's events. He chattered happily about the toys and costumes he'd found, oblivious to his mother's growing anxiety. Claire decided to distract him with a trip to the park, hoping to keep his mind off the Playhouse while she sought answers. They spent the morning at the park, Max playing with newfound friends while Claire sat on a bench, her mind racing. She couldn't let her fear show, not in front of Max. But as she watched him play, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. After lunch, Claire took Max to the library. She hoped the librarian, Mrs. Granger, might have more information, or at least point her in the right direction. As they walked through the library doors, the familiar scent of old books and polished wood greeted them. Mrs. Granger looked up from her desk and smiled warmly. "Back again so soon? How can I help you today?" Claire hesitated, glancing at Max. "Do you have any books or records about supernatural occurrences in Willow Creek? Specifically about the old Playhouse?" Mrs. Granger's smile faded slightly and she nodded. "We do have a few more detailed accounts and some folklore collections. Follow me." She led Claire to a section filled with dusty tomes and old records. Max wandered off to the children's section, and Claire was grateful for the distraction. Mrs. Granger handed her a stack of books and a few yellowed newspapers. "Be careful, dear," Mrs. Granger said softly. "The Playhouse has a dark history, and some things are best left undisturbed." Claire nodded, her determination unwavering. She sat down at a nearby table and began to sift through the materials. One book, in particular, caught her attention. It was titled Haunted Willow Creek, Tales of the Supernatural. As she flipped through the pages, she found a chapter dedicated to the Playhouse. The stories were chilling, accounts of ghostly children, strange lights, and unexplained sounds. One story stood out. A local psychic had once tried to cleanse the Playhouse but had been driven away by an unseen force. According to the account, the psychic believed that the children's spirits were being controlled by a dark entity, preventing them from moving on. Claire's heart pounded as she read. Could this dark entity be the former director, Victor Hargrave? She needed to know more. She made a note of the psychic's name, Madame Lydia, and decided to find her. Just as she closed the book, Max came running over, holding an old, battered book. "Mom, look what I found. It's about the Playhouse." Claire took the book from him, her fingers trembling slightly. The cover was faded, but she could make out the title, The Phantom Playhouse, A History of Hauntings. She flipped through it, finding detailed accounts of the fire, the children's deaths, and subsequent hauntings. "Where did you find this, Max?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was on a shelf over there," Max replied, pointing. "Can we read it together?" Claire nodded and they sat down to read. The book was filled with first-hand accounts from townsfolk, describing strange occurrences at the Playhouse. One account in particular sent chills down Claire's spine. It described a child who had gone missing, only to be found days later, confused and unable to remember what had happened. The child claimed to have been playing with ghost friends at the Playhouse. As they read, Claire felt a growing sense of urgency. She needed to find Madame Lydia and understand what they were dealing with. She thanked Mrs. Granger and checked out the books. They headed home, Claire's mind racing with plans. That evening, as Max played in the living room, Claire called a few local businesses until she finally found Madame Lydia's contact information. She scheduled an appointment for the next day, hoping the psychic could shed some light on the dark presence in the Playhouse. Later, after Max had gone to bed, Claire sat by the fire reading through the haunted accounts again. The more she read, the more she understood that the Playhouse was not just a building. It was a trap, a lure for innocent souls. She was determined to protect Max no matter the cost. As the fire crackled and the house settled around her, Claire thought she heard the faint sound of children's laughter again, echoing through the night. She shivered, pulling her sweater tighter around her. Tomorrow she would face whatever haunted the Playhouse, and she would find a way to free the trapped spirits and keep her son safe. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of ghostly children and a sinister figure watching from the shadows. The Playhouse loomed large in her mind, a dark presence that refused to be ignored. But Claire was resolute. She would not let fear control her. She would face the darkness and protect her son from the ghostly games of the Phantom Playhouse. The next morning, Claire woke with a sense of purpose. Today she would meet Madame Lydia and hopefully gain some clarity about the Playhouse and the dark presence that haunted it. After a quick breakfast, she dropped Max off at a neighbor's house, explaining that she had some important errands to run. Max, still excited about the Playhouse, barely noticed her departure. The drive to Madame Lydia's residence took Claire out of Willow Creek and into the surrounding countryside. The landscape was a patchwork of rolling hills and dense woods, the road winding like a serpent through the terrain. Claire's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her mind racing with questions and a flicker of hope. Madame Lydia's home was a quaint cottage nestled at the edge of a forest, shrouded in an air of mystery. The garden was filled with herbs and flowers, their scents mingling in the crisp morning air. Claire took a deep breath and knocked on the door. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 60s, with long silver hair cascading over her shoulders and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight into Claire's soul. She wore a flowing dress of deep purple, adorned with silver jewelry that clinked softly as she moved. "Claire Johnson?" the woman asked, her voice soft but firm. "Yes, I'm Claire," she replied, trying to mask her nervousness. "Please, come in. I'm Lydia," the psychic said, stepping aside to let Claire enter. The inside of the cottage was warm and inviting, filled with the scent of burning sage and a hint of lavender. Candles flickered on shelves lined with books and crystals, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Lydia led Claire to a small sitting room and gestured for her to sit. "Tell me what brings you here, Claire," Lydia said, settling into an armchair opposite her. Claire took a deep breath and recounted her experiences at the Playhouse, the eerie atmosphere, the ghostly laughter, and the sinister presence she felt. She described Max's fascination with the place and her growing fear for his safety. Lydia listened intently, her expression grave. When Claire finished, the psychic leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Claire's. "The Playhouse is a place of great darkness," Lydia said. "It was not always so, but the tragedy that occurred there created a rift between our world and the spirit world. The children's spirits are trapped, bound by a malevolent force." "Do you know who or what this force is?" Claire asked, her heart pounding. Lydia nodded slowly. The director, Victor Hargrave. His obsession with the Playhouse and the children led to his own demise, but his spirit remains twisted and vengeful. He seeks to complete his final play, using the souls of the children and anyone else he can draw in. Claire's mind raced as she absorbed this information. How do we stop him? How do we free the children? Lydia's gaze intensified. There is a ritual, but it is dangerous. It requires confronting Hargrave's spirit and breaking his hold over the Playhouse. You will need courage and a strong will. Are you prepared for that? Claire nodded, determination filling her. I'll do whatever it takes to protect my son and those children. Lydia rose and retrieved a small, leather-bound book from a shelf. She handed it to Claire. This contains the ritual. Study it carefully. You will need certain items: candles, salt, and a personal belonging of one of the children, if you can find it. Claire took the book, her fingers trembling slightly. Thank you, Lydia. I don't know what I would have done without your help. Be careful, Claire, Lydia warned. The Playhouse is a place of great power. Trust your instincts and stay strong. Claire left the cottage with a mixture of fear and determination. She stopped at a store to gather the necessary items for the ritual and then headed back to Willow Creek. Her mind was focused on the task ahead, but she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to her. When she arrived home, Max was waiting for her, his eyes alight with curiosity. Did you find out anything about the Playhouse, Mom? He asked eagerly. Claire forced a smile. I did, Max. We're going to help the children there, but I need you to stay safe and listen to everything I say, okay? Max nodded, his trust in his mother unwavering. Claire spent the rest of the day preparing for the ritual, carefully studying the book and gathering the items she needed. She found an old photograph of the children who had performed at the Playhouse tucked inside one of the library books, a relic that would serve as the personal belonging Lydia had mentioned. As night fell, Claire felt a sense of resolve settle over her. She knew what she had to do, and she was ready to face the darkness head-on. She tucked Max into bed, kissing his forehead and reassuring him that everything would be all right. Then, as the clock struck midnight, Claire gathered her supplies and headed back to the Playhouse. The air was thick with tension, the forest silent as if holding its breath. She crossed the threshold, feeling the familiar chill as she entered the Playhouse once more. The shadows seemed to dance around her, the air heavy with the presence of the spirits. Claire set up the candles and salt, creating a protective circle in the center of the room. She placed the photograph at the heart of the circle, her hand steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Taking a deep breath, Claire began to chant the words from Lydia's book, her voice strong and unwavering. The air around her seemed to pulse with energy, the shadows growing darker and more menacing. But Claire held her ground, her focus unwavering. As the ritual reached its climax, a figure materialized before her. A tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. Victor Hargrave. "You dare to challenge me?" he hissed, his voice echoing with malice. "I will free these children," Claire replied, her voice firm. "You have no power over them anymore." Hargrave's laugh was cold and hollow. "We shall see." The room seemed to tremble as the two forces clashed, light against dark, will against malevolence. Claire felt a surge of strength, fueled by her love for Max and her determination to end this nightmare. She continued the chant, her voice rising above Hargrave's taunts. Suddenly, a blinding light filled the room, and the shadows recoiled, Hargrave's form disintegrating into nothingness. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air grew warm and still. The laughter of children filled the space, but this time, it was joyous and free. Claire sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She had done it. She had freed the children. The Playhouse, once a place of horror, was now silent and at peace. Exhausted but triumphant, Claire gathered her things and left the Playhouse. As she walked back through the woods, she felt a sense of closure. The darkness had been vanquished, and the spirits were finally at rest. When she arrived home, she found Max asleep, a peaceful expression on his face. Claire kissed his forehead, whispering a promise to always protect him. She knew that their lives would never be the same, but they had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. The Playhouse would remain a relic of the past, its secrets uncovered and its spirits freed. And Claire, with her son by her side, was ready to embrace whatever the future held, knowing that they had the strength to overcome any challenge. Claire had hoped that their ordeal was over, that the Playhouse's dark influence had been vanquished. But as days turned into weeks, she began to notice subtle changes in Max. He was quieter, more withdrawn, his once bright eyes now clouded with a shadow she couldn't quite place. One evening, while preparing dinner, Claire overheard Max talking in his room. At first, she thought he might be on the phone, but when she peeked in, she saw him alone, facing the corner, whispering to someone unseen. "Max," she called softly, her voice tinged with worry. Max turned, his face lighting up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hi, Mom. Just talking to my friends." Claire's heart skipped a beat. "Your friends? Who are they?" Max's smile faded. "The kids from the Playhouse. They visit me sometimes." A chill ran down Claire's spine. She had hoped that freeing the children's spirits had put an end to this, but it seemed the Playhouse's influence lingered. Determined to get to the bottom of this, she decided to follow Max the next time he visited the Playhouse. That night, Claire barely slept. She lay awake, listening for any sign of Max stirring. In the early hours of the morning, she heard it, the creak of floorboards, the soft padding of footsteps. She slipped out of bed and followed Max, careful to keep her distance. Max moved with an unsettling purpose, his steps sure and steady as he made his way through the woods. Claire followed, her heart pounding in her chest. They reached the Playhouse, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. Max slipped through the broken door, and Claire hesitated before following. The air inside was thick with a familiar chill, the shadows deeper than ever. She watched as Max approached the stage, where a group of ghostly children stood, their eyes fixed on him. A spectral figure stepped forward, and Claire's breath caught in her throat. It was Victor Hargrave, his form twisted and gaunt, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "Welcome back, Max," Hargrave said, his voice a sinister whisper. "We've been waiting for you." Max nodded, his face devoid of emotion. He climbed onto the stage, joining the ghostly children in a rehearsed performance. Claire watched in horror as they moved through the motions of a play, their actions eerie and mechanical. Unable to remain silent any longer, Claire stepped forward. "Max, stop! Come back to me!" Hargrave's eyes flickered to Claire, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Ah, Claire, you thought you could free them, but their souls are bound to this place, and now your son will join them." "No!" Claire cried, her voice echoing through the Playhouse. "I won't let you take him!" She rushed forward, but an invisible force knocked her back. Hargrave laughed, the sound echoing with malevolent glee. Claire struggled to her feet, her mind racing. She had to break Hargrave's hold over Max and the children. But how? She remembered the ritual Lydia had given her, the one that had seemed to work. But But perhaps there was another way, something more personal. Taking a deep breath, Claire stepped forward again, her eyes locked on Max. Max, remember who you are. Remember the fun we had, the love we share. Come back to me. Max's movements faltered, his eyes flickering with recognition. The ghostly children paused, their expressions confused. Hargrave's smile faded, replaced by a snarl. You cannot break my hold, Claire. He belongs to me now. No, he doesn't, Claire said, her voice filled with resolve. Max, you are stronger than this. Fight him. Come back to me. Max's eyes cleared, and he took a step toward her. The ghostly children followed, their forms growing fainter. Hargrave's rage filled the air, but Claire ignored him, focusing solely on her son. That's it, Max. Come back, she whispered, her heart aching with love and fear. Max reached out, his hand finding hers. The connection broke Hargrave's hold, and the playhouse trembled as the spirits of the children began to fade, their laughter turning to cries of joy and relief. Hargrave's form wavered, his power diminishing. No, this is not over, Claire. I will return. With a final burst of light, the playhouse fell silent. Claire clung to Max, her heart pounding with relief and exhaustion. They stumbled out into the night, the playhouse behind them finally at peace. Back at home, Claire held Max close, whispering soothing words until he fell asleep. She knew that Hargrave's threat was not an idle one, but for now, they were safe, and she would do everything in her power to keep it that way. As she lay awake, the memory of the ghostly rehearsal haunted her. The playhouse's dark history had not been fully laid to rest, and Claire knew that she would have to remain vigilant. But for tonight, she allowed herself a moment of peace, holding her son close and hoping that the worst was behind them. Claire spent the following days in a state of constant vigilance. She couldn't shake the feeling that Hargrave's spirit was still lingering, watching and waiting for an opportunity to reclaim his hold over Max and the other children. Determined to protect her son and finally put an end to the playhouse's dark influence, she decided to delve deeper into the history of Victor Hargrave. Returning to the library, Claire sought out Mrs. Granger, hoping the librarian could provide more insight into Hargrave's life and motivations. Mrs. Granger greeted her with a sympathetic smile and led her to a back room filled with old records and documents. Victor Hargrave was an enigma, Mrs. Granger explained as she sorted through the files. He was a brilliant director, but there were always rumors about his methods. Some said he was obsessed with perfection to the point of madness. Claire shivered at the thought. Do you have any records of his personal life? Anything that might explain his connection to the playhouse? Mrs. Granger nodded and handed Claire a bundle of yellowed papers. These are letters and diary entries from Hargrave that were donated to the library after his death. Perhaps they can shed some light on his motivations. Claire thanked her and sat down at a nearby table, carefully reading through the fragile documents. The letters revealed a man consumed by his passion for the theater, driven by a relentless desire to create the perfect performance. But as she read further, Claire found disturbing hints of a darker obsession. One diary entry, in particular, caught her attention. Dated just weeks before the fire, Hargrave wrote about his frustration with the children's inability to meet his exacting standards. He mentioned an ancient ritual he had discovered, one that promised to bind the souls of the performers to the playhouse, ensuring their eternal dedication to the craft. Claire's blood ran cold as she read the final lines of the entry. The ritual will be completed on the night of the play. The children will never leave. Their spirits will be mine to direct forever. Realizing the depth of Hargrave's madness, Claire felt a surge of anger and determination. She had to find a way to break the ritual's hold permanently. With renewed purpose, she returned home and gathered Max, deciding to confront the Playhouse one last time. That evening, as the sun set and shadows lengthened, Claire and Max made their way to the Playhouse. The air was thick with tension, the forest eerily silent. Claire carried the leather-bound book Lydia had given her, along with the items needed for the ritual. Max, sensing the gravity of the situation, stayed close by her side. Inside the Playhouse, the atmosphere was oppressive, the air heavy with the weight of trapped souls. Claire set up the ritual circle in the center of the room, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. She placed the candles, salt, and the old photograph of the children at the heart of the circle. Taking a deep breath, Claire began to chant the words from Lydia's book, her voice strong and unwavering. The air around her seemed to pulse with energy, the shadows growing darker and more menacing. Max stood at the edge of the circle, watching with wide eyes. As the ritual progressed, a figure began to materialize in the center of the circle. Victor Hargrave, his form twisted and gaunt, his eyes burning with a cold fire. He looked at Claire with a mixture of anger and admiration. "You are persistent, Claire," he said, his voice a sinister whisper. "But you cannot break my hold over them." "We'll see about that," Claire replied, her voice firm. She continued the chant, focusing all her energy on breaking the ritual. Hargrave's form wavered, and he let out a snarl of rage. "You think you can defy me? I will not be defeated by a mere mortal." Claire felt a surge of power as the ritual reached its climax. She locked eyes with Hargrave, pouring all her love for Max and the trapped children into her words. The air crackled with energy, and the Playhouse trembled as light and dark forces clashed. With a final defiant cry, Claire completed the ritual. A blinding light filled the room, and Hargrave's form disintegrated into nothingness. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air grew warm and still. The ghostly children appeared, their forms faint but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," one of them whispered, their voice a soft echo. Claire sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She had done it. She had freed the children and destroyed Hargrave's hold over the Playhouse. Max ran to her, hugging her tightly, and Claire held him close, her heart filled with relief and exhaustion. They left the Playhouse together, the night air cool and refreshing. Claire felt a sense of closure, knowing that the darkness had finally been vanquished. As they walked back through the woods, she looked down at Max, his eyes bright and filled with trust. "Is it over, Mom?" he asked softly. Claire smiled, her heart swelling with love and pride. "Yes, Max, it's over. The Playhouse won't haunt us anymore." Back at home, Claire tucked Max into bed, feeling a peace she hadn't known in weeks. She knew that their lives would never be the same, but they had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. The Playhouse, once a place of horror, was now a silent relic of the past, its secrets uncovered and its spirits freed. As Claire lay in bed, she listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. But this time there was no eerie laughter, no ghostly whispers. Just the peaceful silence of a home finally free from the shadows. And for the first time in a long while, Claire allowed herself to hope for a brighter future. The relief that Claire had felt after the ritual was short-lived. Despite her best efforts to assure Max and herself that the Playhouse was no longer a threat, an unsettling feeling persisted. It was as if the darkness had not been fully banished, merely pushed into the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. One evening, a few days after the ritual, Claire received a phone call from Lydia. The psychic's voice was grave, her usual calm replaced by urgency. "Claire, I fear that the ritual may not have been enough," Lydia said. "Hargrave's spirit is powerful, and his connection to the Playhouse is deep. There may be one final act we must perform to ensure his hold is broken for good." Claire felt a chill run down her spine. "What do we need to do?" "We must perform a final ritual at the Playhouse, but this time, we need to involve all the spirits that are trapped there. It's risky, but it's the only way to break Hargrave's hold completely." Claire agreed, knowing that she had to see this through to the end. They set a time for that night, and Claire prepared herself mentally for the confrontation. She explained to Max that they needed to return to the Playhouse one last time to make sure the children could rest in peace. As the sun set and darkness fell, Claire and Max made their way to the Playhouse, meeting Lydia at the edge of the woods. The air was thick with tension, the forest unnaturally quiet as if it, too, was holding its breath. Lydia greeted them with a nod, her face serious. "Are you ready?" Claire nodded, holding Max's hand tightly. "We're ready." They entered the Playhouse, the familiar chill wrapping around them. The shadows seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and Claire could feel Hargrave's presence more strongly than ever. They set up the ritual circle in the center of the room, lighting candles and placing the photograph of the children at the heart of the circle. Lydia began to chant, her voice strong and commanding. Claire and Max joined in, their voices blending with hers. The air crackled with energy, the shadows deepening as the ritual progressed. Claire felt a surge of power, fueled by her love for Max and her determination to protect him. Suddenly, the air grew icy, and Hargrave's figure materialized in the center of the circle, his eyes burning with fury. "You think you can defeat me?" he hissed, his voice echoing with malice. "I will never let them go." Claire stepped forward, her voice steady. "We will free them, Hargrave. Your hold over them ends tonight." The ghostly children appeared around Hargrave, their forms flickering as if caught between worlds. They looked at Claire and Max with pleading eyes, their faces filled with hope and fear. Lydia continued to chant, her voice rising in intensity. The Playhouse trembled as the forces of light and dark clashed, the air thick with the power of the ritual. Claire felt a surge of strength, her love for Max giving her the courage to face Hargrave head-on. With a final defiant cry, Claire and Max joined their voices with Lydia's, their combined power overwhelming Hargrave's malevolent presence. The room filled with a blinding light, and Hargrave's form disintegrated into nothingness. The ghostly children let out cries of joy and relief as their spirits were finally freed. The Playhouse grew silent, the oppressive weight lifting as the spirits departed. Claire sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. Max ran to her, hugging her tightly, and Claire held him close, her heart filled with relief and exhaustion. Lydia approached them, her face serene. "It's over, Claire. The spirits are free and Hargrave's hold is broken for good." Claire looked up at Lydia, gratitude and relief washing over her. "Thank you, Lydia. I couldn't have done this without you." Lydia smiled gently. "You had the strength all along, Claire. Love is the most powerful force of all." As they left the Playhouse, the night air was cool and refreshing. Claire felt a sense of closure, knowing that the darkness had finally been vanquished. She looked down at Max, his eyes bright and filled with trust. "Is it really over, Mom?" he asked softly. Claire smiled, her heart swelling with love and pride. "Yes, Max. It's really over. The Playhouse won't haunt us anymore." Back at home, Claire tucked Max into bed, feeling a peace she hadn't known in weeks. She knew that their lives would never be the same, but they had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. The Playhouse, once a place of horror, was now a silent relic of the past, its secrets uncovered and its spirits freed. As Claire lay in bed, she listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. But this time there was no eerie laughter, no ghostly whispers, just the peaceful silence of a home finally free from the shadows. And for the first time in a long while, Claire allowed herself to hope for a brighter future. The following days were filled with a sense of tranquility that Claire hadn't experienced since moving to Willow Creek. The house felt lighter, and the oppressive feeling that had hung over them was finally gone. Max seemed happier, more like his old self, and Claire allowed herself to hope that their ordeal was truly behind them. One afternoon, as Claire was tidying up the living room, she found an old, dusty box that she didn't recognize. Inside, she discovered a collection of photographs and playbills from the Playhouse, dating back decades. Among them was a photograph of Victor Hargrave, standing with the children who had perished in the fire. Claire felt a chill as she looked at their innocent faces, now free from the Playhouse's malevolent influence. Determined to ensure that the Playhouse's dark history was never forgotten, Claire decided to document her experiences. She wanted to write a comprehensive account of the events, hoping that it would serve as a warning and a testament to the power of love and courage. She spent evenings at her desk, writing feverishly, her words flowing onto the pages as she recounted the haunting and their battle to free the spirits. One evening, as she was finishing a particularly emotional chapter, the doorbell rang. Claire opened the door to find Mrs. Granger standing there, holding a stack of books and a warm smile. "I heard about what you and Max did," Mrs. Granger said, her eyes filled with admiration. "The town owes you a great debt." Claire invited her in, and they sat in the living room, discussing the Playhouse and its history. Mrs. Granger shared more stories about the town's past, filling in gaps and providing context that Claire had been missing. "It's remarkable what you've accomplished," Mrs. Granger said, sipping her tea. "You've brought peace to those children and to this town." As they talked, Claire felt a sense of closure. She had faced the darkness, confronted her fears, and emerged victorious. The Playhouse was now just an old building, its ghosts laid to rest, its secrets uncovered. However, the Playhouse itself still stood, a decaying monument to its tragic past. Claire decided that it needed to be properly memorialized and safely sealed off. She approached the town council with her proposal, sharing her story and the need to ensure that no one else would fall victim to its dark influence. The council, moved by Claire's account, agreed to her plan. A small group of volunteers, including Claire and Mrs. Granger, set about clearing the Playhouse of its remnants and securing the building. They erected a memorial plaque outside, honoring the children who had died and acknowledging the efforts to free their spirits. The day of the dedication ceremony was bright and clear, a stark contrast to the dark days they had endured. The townspeople gathered to pay their respects, and Claire felt a swell of pride and relief as she stood beside Max, knowing that they had made a difference. As the crowd dispersed, Max tugged on Claire's sleeve. "Mom, can we go inside one last time?" Claire hesitated, but then nodded. "All right, Max. One last time." They entered the Playhouse, now empty and silent. The air was cool and still, the shadows no longer menacing. They walked through the rooms, memories of their harrowing experiences flashing through Claire's mind. But there was no fear now, only a sense of peace. In the main performance area, Claire and Max stood together, looking around at the space that had once been filled with darkness. Max reached out and took her hand, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Mom," he said softly. "For everything." Claire smiled, her heart swelling with love. "We did it together, Max, and we'll always have each other." As they left the playhouse for the final time, Claire felt a sense of finality. The curtain had fallen on their ordeal, and a new chapter of their lives was beginning. They walked home hand in hand, the sun setting behind them, casting long shadows that held no fear. That night, as Claire tucked Max into bed, she felt a deep sense of peace. The playhouse was behind them, its ghosts laid to rest. And as she lay in her own bed, she listened to the sounds of their home. A home filled with love, hope, and the promise of a brighter future. The story of the Phantom Playhouse had come to an end, but the memories of their courage and resilience would live on, a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the enduring power of love.